The Watcher, Episode 3, Götterdämmerung? Don't know if I'm saying that right, probably not, but we're gonna go with it. Following the aftermath of Mitch and Mo's death, Theodora and Dean discuss who the Watcher could be now that the pool of suspects has dwindled. During their conversation, we learn that Andrew Pierce is a pathological liar who can't be trusted, which makes everything he's told us basically irrelevant. We get some backstory on Jasper Winslow, who's lived in the neighborhood his entire life with mom, dad, and sister, Pearl. Jasper had a job bagging groceries downtown until November of 1995, when one day he stopped coming into work, which is when his family started making payments to the Avalon Behavioral Health Center for the next 10 years. According to Theodora, Jasper has schizoid disorder with elective mutism, which means he quit talking by choice. In 2001, however, the diagnosis changed to PTSD, which leads us to the conclusion that in 95 he must have saw something so horrifying that he just decided to quit talking. While Dean and Theodora review suspects, Karen and Nora share some more hot goss down at the country club. Karen picks up on Nora's displeasure with her sex life and launches into a conspiracy that Dean must be having an affair with a young intern because he's quote-unquote sexualizing his daughter by not wanting her to grow up too fast. Man, I really can't stand this chick. If this show has done one thing well, it's making sure Karen is as unlikable as possible. And what's even more annoying is Nora keeps feeding her information. It's like, just stop telling her shit. After lunch, Karen shows Nora a house close by and desperately tries to convince her to embrace the dumb bimbo trophy wife lifestyle, but thankfully, Nora's starting to catch on to the fact that Karen isn't the most trustworthy and she has her own agenda. Back at the house, while the contractors do their work, Dean meets John, this weird Christian guy who claims to be the building inspector. John delivers a dramatic speech about the fourth turning, a real theory devised by William Strauss and Neil Howe, the authors of this book. The concept in its most basic form proposes a generational cycle in America in which archetypes arise every 20 to 25 years or every turning. These archetypes correspond to the historic events of each generation and present themselves in the same pattern. Every 4 turnings is called a saeculum, which is about an 80-year span or the span of a human life. And at the end of every 4th turning is a crisis event. So for example, the Revolutionary War, then the Civil War, and then World War II. So, by John's logic, another crisis is due. Before he makes his exit, John tattles on Ellie and Dakota and compares Ellie to his own daughter, who in his words was the school whore. Sensing Dean's agitation, having compared his daughter to a whore, basically, John abruptly ends the conversation, saying to Dean, "You won't be seeing me again." Dean questions him on this because just a few minutes earlier, John said he'd be back when the contractors are done. And John chuckles to himself, then says yes, alluding to us that he's had access to the building this entire time, i.e., he's the figure we've been seeing lurking in the shadows. After John leaves, Dean asks one of the contractors in the basement about him, and it turns out there's no Inspector John in the town of Westfield. How Dean didn't make the connection right then and there kind of boggles my mind. Sometime later, Nora comes home ready for action, but Dean is obviously distracted by the stranger who was just in his house, and this prompts Nora to storm off and leave with the kids for the night. Towards the end of the episode, Theodora calls Dean with some new findings, and they meet up at the old-timey diner where she tells Dean the story of the Graff family, who lived at 657 Boulevard until 1995. John Graff was an Army vet turned accountant that loved his family and his church. He had an apartment in the Upper East Side until one late night, a couple of guys that were up to no good started causing trouble in the neighborhood. He got his ass beat and his mom got scared and said, "We're moving to the town of Westfield, New Jersey." He lived in the house with his son Dale, daughter Pat, wife Ellen, and his mother. One day, John was fired from work, but he never told his family. Instead, he just decided to pretend to go to work every day, slowly draining his mother's accounts to pay the bills. Why didn't he just go try to find a new job? Well, your guess is as good as mine. During this time frame, he starts receiving letters from the Watcher, and comes home to find his daughter throwing a Halloween party and rubbing up against her teacher. That's a yikes. Not long after this, the Watcher convinces John to give the house what it wants and kill his family. John caps his wife in the back of the head as she confesses her intention to have an affair, then shoots his mother, and when his daughter comes home from school, he shoots her too. He makes himself a sandwich, as you do after a triple kill, then goes to his son's basketball game. When they get home, he murders his son, then dims the lights and puts on some music to set the mood. The very same music that's been coming from the attic. The bodies would lay there in the house, decomposing for 2 whole weeks, until one day Jasper heard music coming from the house. Jasper would find the bodies with the blood drained out of them like mummies, and in the basement floor, milk jugs that were filled with blood but were now empty. Theodora goes on to reveal that the teacher from the Halloween party was found shot through the back of the head in his car 3 days before the family was murdered, but the bullets from that gun didn't match that of John Graff's. Theodora then produces the letters John Graff received, which she gathered from some old records she got from the police station, courtesy of Detective Chamberlain, who seemed weirdly excited to turn them over for some reason. Now, seeing as how such a horrific event would have been devastating to the real estate market in Westfield, the police covered the whole thing up in order to preserve the image of a peaceful, quiet town. Conveniently, though, Chamberlain didn't join the force until 2005, and Mitch and Mo moved in a year after the murders, so nobody knew anything about it. In fact, nobody even knows what John Graff looks like anymore because he destroyed all photographic evidence that he existed before he killed his family. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's stupid. And you would be right to think that. You mean to tell me that there's no pictures of him as a child from a yearbook or something? You know, just no photos of this guy? It's not like we were back in the 1900s when this happened. This was like a few decades ago at most. I mean, surely he had a yearbook, and if he did, all the police would have to do is run it through one of those de-aging programs, and there you go. You know what's even dumber? He went through the trouble of cutting himself out of all the photos instead of just burning the whole photo. Like, why go through the trouble of cutting yourself out just to burn it? You could have just burned the whole thing. Anyway, Dean finally comes to the realization that the man named John that was in his house earlier was indeed John Graff, or so we think, and he immediately goes to the Winslow residence to speak with Jasper. But before he can get very far, Pearl slams the door in his face and criticizes him for not attending Mitch and Mo's funeral. How very unneighborly of you, Dean. Back at the house, Nora and the kids settle in as Dean comes home for the night. We see a figure watching them from outside, and the next morning, Dean takes the kids to school while Nora shows the whole neighborhood just how pointing her nipples are. She checks the mail to find yet another letter, this time talking about how the security cameras won't help, and the episode ends with someone looking down at her from inside the house, presumably John Graff. Alrighty, now for my thoughts. I guess I'll start by saying I was wrong. Jasper wasn't holding a gun at the end of the last episode because there's absolutely zero mention of it. So I dropped the ball on that one. Also, I'm sure most people picked up on it or probably didn't care, but just in case you missed it, the lipstick that Ellie found in the first episode belonged to Pat Graff. So, you know, it turns out my herpes joke held a little more validity than I could have anticipated. Anyway, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the Watcher's letters to John because they're a little bit different than the ones Dean's been getting. With Dean, the letters have just been vaguely threatening and just seem to be aiming to make him paranoid, but with John, the Watcher uses his faith to convince him to murder his family. John's letters would say things like his family's going to a better place and the Watcher would watch them even from there. It's almost like the Watcher was sort of tricking John into thinking that he's getting these letters from God, or at least from someone convincing John to act out the will of God, which now begs the question, if John's not the Watcher, then who? Well, if we apply the theory of Occam's razor that Theodora was talking about, based on what we've seen from episodes 1 to 3, it only makes sense, in my opinion, for the Watcher to be Pearl Winslow. She's lived in the neighborhood her whole life, she's very familiar with the house, she's been inside of it, she doesn't want contractors renovating it, you know, she's very controlling and delusional and seems just unhinged enough to fit the profile. John Graff still seems dangerous and psychotic, but I think if anything, he's a pawn for Pearl Winslow. Of course, it's still possible that the Watcher's a group of people. Earlier in the episode, Theodora and Chamberlain both used the phrase, "you're barking up the wrong tree," which Dean himself mentions. You know, now that I think about it, there's been a lot of references to trees. Maybe the Preservation Society Pearl keeps talking about is actually a secret group of living tree people that control Westfield. Just imagine the show takes a drastic turn to supernatural horror. All the trees are just uprooting and attacking the townspeople. That would be kind of dope, I'm not gonna lie. I might actually prefer to see that. Regardless of who the Watcher is, though, John's story doesn't quite make sense. Either we don't have all the pieces, or the writers just ignored some very obvious plot holes, like, did nobody hear the gunshots? And if John's been secretly living in the house still, how has nobody ever seen him coming and going? I guess we'll have to wait and see if we get some more answers in the next episode, though I gotta say, I'm not as intrigued as I was going into this. Hopefully the writing doesn't get any worse as the show progresses, but I kind of have a feeling it just might. Either way, though, I'm going to stick with it till the bitter end, and I will see you in the next episode. Peace.